Hello, my name is James Stone from jamesstone.com, and in this video I am going to take you on a deep dive into Foundation 5 Sass. Now you might be wondering, what do I mean by deep dive? Let me tell you, we're going to get our hands dirty. We're going to jump into the source code of ZURB Foundation, the Sass that makes up the CSS portion of the ZURB Foundation 5 framework. I'm going to tell you why you might want to do something crazy like that, so hang in there. So maybe you've already gone to the Foundation website. This is the Foundation website, and took a look through the docs and maybe read about how to use Sass, right? And I have another video if you're interested talking about the settings.scss and kind of my point of view of how to do that. And there's basically a bunch of Sass variables that you can uncomment and kind of theme, so to speak, the framework. I don't know if theme is the correct word, maybe skin it or create the style of it. And you have a bunch of different types of things that you can do, padding, colors, so on and so forth. But eventually, and I think pretty quick, you're going to want to go beyond just changing the default settings. So how do you do that? Well, if you've looked at any of the, I'll just pick something here, simple, maybe the button. Oh no, too many buttons. So if you go to buttons, and this is really any sort of component in Foundation that has a Sass component, over here you're going to have all the presentational markup. So if you want to be advanced, you want to go Sass, go all the way to the bottom. So if you go to the bottom and then scroll up, you'll see this section called Semantic Markup with Sass. And basically what they do here is they show you the different ways and give you an example of the simple way to use an include. And this is a Sass mixin called button. And then they give you a more advanced version. And usually what you end up doing, and I do this myself because I don't have any sort of snippets, is you come here, you grab like this whole block of text, copy and paste it into your favorite text editor, and then you start removing the comments and maybe you change the variables, and then you might do join to put it all on one line. So at some point, you're going to want to go beyond this. You're going to want to go beyond just the basic mixin, and maybe you're even wondering, well, how does this mixin even work? I'm going to show you. It's really simple. So I'm going to start by creating a Foundation project. So here we are, we have our standard Foundation project. We could even run grunt here in the background if we're going to update any of our Sass files, which I'm probably not going to do. So you're probably already familiar, right? If you're looking at your project, you have this app.scss and your settings.scss. This settings is basically all of the different things that you can change, kind of default variables that you can use with Foundation. The app.scss is basically showing you how all of these imports are going to work. So if you got a little more advanced, you might have gotten into customizing this. Maybe you commented out Foundation and then selectively included components. If you've looked at my performance book, you'll notice that what I like to do is put all these imports on independent lines so I can just turn them on or off on the fly. I don't really like the structure with all the, commas at the end of the line, but you could do it either way. So let's start our deep dive by looking at import Foundation and see how that works. So if you open up your Bower components and then you open up Foundation and then you open up SCSS, we're going to be looking at this structure. Okay, import Foundation. It already knows to go in here. It already knows to go into the SCSS file. Now, let's start here, foundation.scss. Here we go. You'll see there actually is not a huge difference between these files. And also you'll notice that the import statements that I like to use are exactly like this. In fact, you could just take all of these files or all of these import statements and just paste them all here, right? And, I always like to have the Foundation import left, and I'll tell you why. So you might add all of these and then just comment this out. The reason why is if you start to remove a lot of these, right, and you're optimizing for performance, when you come back and you want to prototype quickly or play around with different components, it's really easy. You can just uncomment this while leaving all of these alone, and it's going to go ahead and let you kind of import blanket style all of Foundation. So if you want to prototype or quickly work with the framework, you turn this on, and then you go back and refine it later on and turn on the individual components later. So little tip for you. But let's take a look. What else happens here? The character set, there's some comments, nothing really that exciting. So let's jump into one of these components and see how it works. And I think we should start with buttons because it's one of the easiest ones to understand. Okay, so this might be a little bit daunting at first, but I assure you, it's not that complex. So this works just like the app, and so it imports global. We could later on go and take a look at what global, how does that work, what is it importing? And then you can see they're setting variables, right? Include HTML button classes, include HTML classes, and then you have this exclamation point default keyword. So the important thing to remember, it's a little bit different than variables you might use with JavaScript where they keep getting redefined. What this means is that in this import global, or prior to calling this, if you remember in the app.scss, we're actually calling settings first in order. So we're actually setting all of these variables, right? So if we're setting the variable prior to it running, then what this does is say, if we haven't changed this value or defined it already, then to set it to this value, which is the one that's in settings. And you'll notice in settings, you have all those types of defaults set as well. So all of the Foundation Sass files typically follow this format for components. And so we start out, you'll have an import, and then you have your variables, right? And they have it pretty well commented. So if you want to figure out how they work, they tell you exactly. We use these to build padding for buttons, right? Button, tiny, small, medium, and large. And these are the only ones that kind of don't conform to the naming structure of most ZURB stuff. So it's good to memorize these: TNY, SML, MED. And here we go. So we've got imports, variables, and down we go in the file. Still variables, and here we go. Now we come to mixins. So if you don't know what mixins are for Sass, basically it's like a function or procedure, and it allows you to take variables. For example, mixin button base, you'll see style, display. And so you take different variables in, and then you can do different things with it. And basically what happens is it returns a bunch of CSS. So it looks like CSS works like a function. And even if you don't understand how these work, you can take a look, because there's some really good examples here of like how you might build your own mixins. So if you get ideas or you want to experiment with mixins, definitely take a look at what ZURB's doing. They've done some pretty smart stuff. So what they've done first, when you see this style true, what that means is that if you don't define it or override it, it will be by default true, right? And so display will automatically take this button display variable. So if you were to type in your import button base and just leave it blank like this, it would basically be the same as if it said true and then button display with a comma. So just keep in mind, this is kind of like the default values again, if it's not already been set. It's a little bit different than other languages. So if we go down a little bit farther, I'm going to come back to the mixins, but I want to show how this is working. So these are the mixins when you're talking about using semantic HTML with Sass mixins. So when we go to the Foundation site and it's talking about this stuff, custom button class, include button, that's what's going on. Now it's not this button base, but if we scroll down, we'll be able to see that. Button size, mixin, button style, button. Now, if you take a look at this button, it's the same variables that are being set before. So it's basically this exact same thing with some of the comments taken out, right? And what they're doing is they're just kind of chunking together a bunch of other mixins to kind of simplify and explain how you're creating a button. So again, we're going to come back and take a look at mixins, but just keep in mind, if you're curious, how does button work? This is how you start. You would go to button, and then you might look at button base first, right? That's probably important. It's the first thing that's done. Okay, so moving down the file, we have this include exports button. If include HTML button classes, button, comma, dot button. So this might look a little bit confusing and it runs down to the end of the file, but I'll tell you what it is. So if we're going down the file, we start with variables. Sorry, actually first imports, variables, right? We have all of our variables, then we have all of our mixins, right? And usually the main mixin, which is kind of like the one that calls all the other ones, is down towards the end of the file, right? We have our button. And then down at the bottom, you're going to see this include exports button. If include HTML button classes. So this is a conditional statement, right? And this is basically what generates all of the presentational CSS files for Foundation. So if you've set this before, include HTML button classes or include HTML classes in your settings.scss, you can actually turn off automatically, just by changing one variable, all of the presentational CSS. So if you wanted to create all of your own buttons through, Sass mixins or through your own CSS, this is how you would do that. You could turn off the variable, but it still include the component, the Sass or SCSS component, and that would give you access to all of the variables and give you access to all of the mixins, while not rendering or cluttering your CSS file with any presentational classes. Okay, so this is also really great if you want to learn SCSS or Sass a little bit better. So let's take a look at what happens. So we're going to include all the HTML button classes. So yes, it means render out all of the buttons, and you'll see it's applied to the button element as well as anything that has dot button. And you'll see a dot button, they're calling button base, right? We're using button size, we're using button style. And so these are all going to render out all of the CSS, right, for the button. Now you get down here and you'll see this ampersand, right? So you might be wondering, what does this ampersand do? I'm going to explain very quickly. It's actually pretty simple. What happens with this ampersand is it basically adds this to the front of it. So what this is going to render into automatically, it will have this button, comma, dot button, and then at the end of it, right, after that closes, let's just pretend like we're closing here, you would actually see button, comma, and it would automatically add in dot secondary, comma, dot button, dot secondary, right? And then it would continue to render all of this CSS. And so what's nice is it looks like nested CSS, but it actually renders out to this much more efficient way of declaring the CSS. This is all kind of automatic and you get it for free. And you can go in even another deeper level. So here, if you had within this secondary, let's say another ampersand setting, whatever, this would also continue to expand and build all of these, but separate in its own kind of block. Okay, I'm going to undo all those changes. Definitely don't want to be changing our foundation source, right? Here we go. So back down to what we were looking at. So anyways, these are all rendering out, and the ampersand just means put button on dot button or whatever you have here, one level up, the parent, in front of it. And sometimes you'll see like this, sometimes you'll see like this, or with other selectors. So just keep in mind that's what the ampersand does. Right, and same thing here, you can have ampersand dot disabled. And if you're going to have multiple selectors, comma, you also have to include the ampersand twice. So just keep that in mind if you're creating your own Sass mixins. And so basically we're just calling a bunch of mixins, right? So they've made it really simple. They show exactly how everything's working. So if you ever wondered how it works that, you know, large or small, what it's doing is it's actually calling button size and setting the padding to a particular variable, right? If you're wondering what happens with radius, it's calling button style, saying the background is false, saying the radius is true. And so if you're doing the mixins yourself, you can kind of follow this style. Like if you want to add the radius to all the buttons, you can follow this exact kind of structure and kind of implement it in your own designs or your own CSS or Sass files. Okay, Firefox 2-pixel fix. This is obviously some sort of, you know, fix for a specific browser. And then here you have a media query. And if you haven't used media queries in Foundation, they're just using this shorthand. And so this is also another Sass thing. So at media, and you have this medium up, right? So let's take a look at what that means. Medium up is what we're looking for. So you'll see medium up is actually just a Sass variable. And this gets a little bit complicated because we're adding a lot of things. So it has also the screen in it. And if you've used things like CoffeeScript, this is exactly the same. It's actually breaking out of the string and placing the variable. So the pound, open brace, close brace, whatever is in between it is a variable that's going to be added to this string. And so basically this is just setting up your media query based on the ranges, and it is all matching Foundation. So you can use this same style if you want to add your own media queries from media up. Very easy to do. Very simple. So for the button, they added a media up media query, which changes how it looks. And so they have button.button, and they have include button base style false display inline block, right? And then they also put full width false. So what they're doing is on browsers that are above medium or up, or so medium or up, basically they're saying don't expand to the full width of the column. So pretty cool. So in a very concise way here, you're generating all of this CSS, which is actually pretty extensive if you look at how it's rendered, for buttons. And it's all being used with variables and the mixins. And you've even got a quick fix for a browser. I guess I didn't see that before. And you've got media queries in here as well. And you see they're nesting several levels deep. And just remember these last two, they're not going crazy here. They have to do with the conditional, which is here. Include exports button, if include HTML button classes. So this basically says, if you set that variable to true, then render out the presentational CSS. So you might be wondering, how should you structure your own Sass files? Well, this is actually a pretty good way to go. Do all your imports at the top if you have any, then do your variables, then your mixins, because your mixins are going to be used by the presentational CSS. And then at the bottom, and I don't often have a conditional for this in the work that I'm doing, but if you were building a framework like Foundation, it would be useful. I don't usually have this part, so usually for myself, I would have something like this at the bottom of the file, right? And this is all relying on those mixins and everything that are above. So I think it's a pretty good structure to look at. It's something I follow quite a bit in my own projects. And then let's take a closer look at some of the mixins and see how they're working. So I said before, this mixin button, it's just kind of calling all of these other mixins, right? So let's start by seeing how this button works and see how complicated is the CSS for creating a button. Maybe it's pretty simple. Maybe you don't need to call button. Maybe it's just button base. So let's start with button base. All right. So button base takes two parameters or arguments, and basically it says if style. So this is a conditional statement. And so if that's set the style to true, which is the default, this is your normal button, it's going to do this. And so you'll see border style. And this is where, if you remember in your settings here, like if we go to button, number 5, like see all these variables, button, tiny, small, large, display, font family, so on and so forth, function, factor. That's where all of these come into play. Now, these are all defined by default to whatever this value is that you see, and you change them, right, by uncommenting them and changing it to a different value, for example. And then you would get different behavior here. So basically, it's calling border style, and this is just standard CSS stuff. The CSS selector, or not selector, but the CSS statement, border style, border width, cursor, right? Cursor pointer value. And these are all variables to make it really easy for you to change all of it. The font family, the font weight, the line height is set to normal. The margin is set to 0, 0, and then button margin bottom. This button margin bottom, this is what gives you like a nice space, like a line space that's underneath each of the buttons. So if you want to remove that, or you ever want to put your buttons closer together, you can just override this, or you could create your own button mix-in. But you can just set the margin bottom to 0. So if you ever run into that, you're trying to change it. Quick tip. Same thing with anything else in typography, headlines, with paragraphs. It's usually the margin bottom that you set to 0 to reduce that space. Okay, position relative, text decoration is none. Text align is the button font align. WebKit appearance is none. WebKit border radius is 0. And then if there's display, then it sets the display to the display value, right? So pretty straightforward. So all this really is, other than the conditional, is a bunch of CSS. And really the only thing different about the CSS from what you would normally find in a standard CSS file are all of these different variables. And all of these different variables are being set, and there's a lot of them from the framework. All right. So you could continue through and you could look at button size and look at some of these other mix-ins are being used for buttons, but the whole purpose of this video is just to get you over the fear of jumping in and looking at some of the Sass source code. It's really not going to bite you. It's super easy to go through. I don't recommend making changes and saving it, but if you ever do, you can always run Bower to bring down the latest files. But it's a kind of a good way to kind of see, like, how are they putting together the Sass mixins? How are they using CSS? How are they creating the buttons, and how are they creating the different elements of Foundation? So if you're new to CSS and new to web development, it's a great tool to learn how CSS is actually being used to create the different elements that you like. Also, if you're more advanced, it's a great way to look at different ways to structure Sass files and a little bit more advanced structures that you can use in your own projects. So I hope this was useful. Thank you for watching, and I'll talk to you next time.
Learn web development with James, books, screencasts, and more at jamesstone.co.